Argentina. Legal framework, the Personal Data Protection Law, PDPL, and additional regulations provide the foundation for data protection. Argentina's framework is aligned with international standards, and the European Commission has recognized it as providing adequate protection. Definitions: personal data and sensitive personal data are clearly defined, with sensitive data encompassing information about racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, and more. National Data Protection Authority, the agency for access to public information, oversees data protection. Registration and consent: there's a mandatory registration for databases, and personal data processing typically requires consent. Bolivia. Legal framework: Bolivia's data protection is currently shaped by the Bill of Personal Data Protection and Constitutional Rights. Definitions: personal data includes identifiable information about natural persons. National Data Protection Authority, the Personal Data Authority, under AGETIC, is designated as the regulatory body. Consent and processing: consent from the data owner is essential for processing personal data. Brazil. Legal framework: the General Data Protection Law, LGPD, sets the stage for data protection in Brazil, focusing on personal and sensitive data processing by any means. Definitions: the LGPD provides specific definitions for personal and sensitive data. National Data Protection Authority, not explicitly mentioned, but the LGPD oversees data protection practices. Consent and rights: data subject consent is crucial, with detailed rights for data subjects to manage their personal information. Chile. Legal framework: Chile relies on the Consumer Protection Agency (SERNAC) and lacks a specific national data protection authority. Electronic marketing and online privacy: guidelines are provided for marketing communications and the use of personal data online. Colombia. Legal framework: Colombia has a comprehensive legal framework, including Law 1266 for financial data and Law 1581 for general personal data protection. National Data Protection Authority: the Superintendence of Industry and Commerce acts as the data protection authority. Data protection offices and registration: specific requirements are outlined for data processing and protection offices. Costa Rica. Legal framework: laws number 7975 and number 8968 regulate personal data handling, with ongoing discussions to update the legislation in line with the GDPR. Definitions and national authority: personal and sensitive data definitions align with global standards, and PRODHAB enforces compliance. Cuba. Legal framework: Cuba does not have a dedicated data protection law but relies on various legal provisions and the Ministry of Communications for regulatory oversight. Dominican Republic. Legal framework: the DPL outlines consent requirements and processing guidelines for personal data, with no specific national data protection authority mentioned. Ecuador. Legal framework: Ecuador's data protection laws are under development, with proposed legislation focusing on safeguarding personal data and aligning with international standards. Definitions and consent: the proposed law includes definitions of personal and sensitive data, emphasizing consent for data processing. El Salvador. Legal framework: El Salvador does not have a specific data protection law but relies on constitutional protections and sectoral laws. A draft data protection law has been proposed. Data protection principles: the draft law outlines principles similar to those in the GDPR, such as lawfulness, fairness, transparency, and accountability. Guatemala. Legal framework: Guatemala's constitution provides the right to privacy, but there's no specific data protection law. However, legislative proposals are being considered. Regulatory authority and consent: in the absence of a dedicated law, data protection practices rely on general principles of consent and privacy rights. Honduras. Legal framework: Honduras has a data protection law that defines personal data and regulates its collection and processing. National Data Protection Authority: the law establishes a national regulator responsible for overseeing data protection practices. Data subject rights: individuals have rights to access, rectify, and delete their data, among others. Mexico. Legal framework: the federal law on the protection of personal data held by private parties, LFPD-PPP, governs data protection in Mexico, along with other specific regulations. National Data Protection Authority: the National Institute of Transparency, Access to Information, and Protection of Personal Data, INAI, is the regulatory body. Registration and data subject rights: there are requirements for data controllers to register databases and detailed rights for individuals regarding their personal data. Nicaragua. Legal framework: Nicaragua's Law 787 outlines the legal basis for data protection, including definitions of personal data and principles for its processing. Consent and rights: consent is a key requirement for processing, with individuals granted rights to control their personal information. Panama. Legal framework. Law number 81 establishes comprehensive data protection regulations in Panama, with clear definitions and principles for data processing. National Data Protection Authority. The law provides for the establishment of a National Data Protection Authority to enforce the regulations. Data subject rights and consent. Detailed provisions are made for consent and the rights of individuals, including access, rectification, and deletion of data. Paraguay. Legal framework. Paraguay is in the process of developing data protection laws, with a focus on aligning with international standards and protecting individual privacy. Data protection and privacy. Proposed legislation includes principles of data processing, consent requirements, and the rights of data subjects. Peru. Legal framework. The Personal Data Protection Law and its regulations provide a detailed framework for data protection in Peru. National Data Protection Authority. The National Authority for Data Protection oversees compliance and enforcement of the law. Data subject rights. The law establishes rights for individuals, including access, rectification, cancellation, and opposition to data processing. Uruguay. Legal framework. Uruguay has a strong data protection regime, with the law on the protection of personal data and habeas data action. International recognition. Uruguay's data protection standards are recognized by the European Union as providing adequate protection. National Data Protection Authority. The regulatory and control unit of personal data protection is responsible for enforcing the law. Venezuela. Legal framework. Venezuela's data protection is guided by the Data Protection Law, which includes provisions for data processing and the rights of individuals. National Data Protection Authority. The law envisages a national authority for data protection, although its implementation details are not specified. This continued overview highlights the varying stages of development and implementation of data protection laws across Latin America. While some countries have established comprehensive legal frameworks and regulatory bodies, others are still in the process of drafting or refining their legislation. Common themes include the importance of consent, the rights of data subjects to manage their personal information, and the move towards alignment with international standards such as the GDPR.